Hey, what's up? Welcome to this first episode. We're going to do 7 videos on Dostoevsky, and I've called it, very unmemorably, Vodka with Dostoevsky, which is a crap name, let's just be honest. But, Russia, vodka, anyway. As you know, first of all, let me just say this. I am clearly not an expert on Dostoevsky in any way, shape, or form. Okay, I got no idea. I've never taken a class on him or anything like that. But over my internet fast, I decided to read The Brothers Karamazov, and I'm so glad that I did. I actually cranked through it in 20 days. If I didn't have kids, I think I could have cranked through it in 10 days. It was so fascinating. I actually tried reading the book about 3 years ago, but for some reason I found it so difficult. But this time I didn't find it difficult at all. I just found it fascinating. So in this introduction, I guess I want to just speak a little bit about why I started reading him and why I quit the internet and how that plays into it. And then, throughout the series of these videos, we're going to be taking a look at different excerpts, primarily from the brothers Karamazov. Because he's a profound writer. A couple of things about Dostoevsky, which is worth noting. French existentialist Albert Camus said that Dostoevsky, not Karl Marx, was the great prophet of the 20th century. Albert Einstein said that he learnt more from Dostoevsky than any other thinker. So he's worth reading. I want to begin with this little line from Crime and Punishment. Okay, so these are 2 different books I got here. Both are Every Man's Library editions. Great translation, beautiful book, you know? I kind of feel like the book has to be beautiful. Especially since it's such a beautiful work, you know? You don't want to have a crappy little paperback that you can't respect. Alright, here's this line. So Raskolnikov, I won't get into it. By the way, there's going to be spoilers throughout this, but Raskolnikov is the main protagonist in Crime and Punishment. And in the beginning of the book, he kills an old woman and her sister. And he goes back home and he crashes on his bed. I just want to read this excerpt for you because there's something in it that I think is just beautiful. He's left the house, he's on the street. He was hardly aware of himself now, and the further he went, the worse it became. He remembered, however, that on coming out to the canal, he had felt afraid because there were too few people, and it was more conspicuous there. Remember, he's just killed 2 old women with an axe, and people have just discovered this murder, so he's leaving quickly, but not running because he doesn't want to be suspected. Though he was nearing collapse, he nevertheless made a detour and arrived home from the completely opposite side. He was not fully conscious when he entered the gates of his house. At least he did not remember about the axe, which he had hiding under his coat, which he had just used to kill the 2 old women with, until he was already on the stairs, and yet a very important task was facing him, to put it back, and, as inconspicuously as possible. Of course, he was no longer capable of realizing that it might be much better for him not to put the axe in its former place at all. This is an axe that he stole for the deed, not his own axe. But he should have maybe left it, somewhere else, and then later on brought it back. Yet everything worked out well. The caretaker's door, from whom he stole the axe, was closed but not locked, meaning that the caretaker was most likely there. But by then, he had so utterly lost the ability to understand anything that he went straight up to the door and opened it. If the caretaker had asked him, "What do you want?" he might simply have handed him the axe. But once again the caretaker was not there, and he had time to put the axe in its former place under the bench. He even covered it with a log as before. He met no one, not a single soul, from then on, all the way to his room. The landlady's door was shut. Okay, we're wrapping to the end here, and it's this one line I want to focus on. He went into his room and threw himself down on the sofa just as he was. He did not sleep, but was as if oblivious. If anyone had come into his room then, he would have jumped up at once and shouted. Here's the line. This is so beautiful. So this guy is in delirium. He tried talking himself and did successfully talk himself into the fact that there was nothing wrong with this crime, right? This old woman, she was a nasty character who would beat her sister, the other old woman who she lived with. She wasn't going to give her her sister anything when she died. She was going to give it to a monastery. And so he's like, look, this is this old bat. She's cranky. She's awful. She's about dead anyway. Might as well kill her. What loss would that be to mankind? Maybe we could even take the money and give it to different families who could then survive, So very much a utilitarian sort of idea, right? But he's frantic, frantic. And he lays on the bed. Listen to this. Bits and scraps of various thoughts kept swarming in his head, but he could not grasp any one of them, could not rest on any one, hard as he tried. That is first-class poetry right there. Listen to that. Bits and scraps of various thoughts kept swarming in his head, but he could not grasp any one of them, could not rest on any one, hard as he tried. Now, the reason I wanted to begin with that quote is because this is very much why I gave up the internet. For 24 days, in case you're wondering, I had planned on giving it up for the entirety of August, but my site was hacked into, then there was all this sex abuse scandal that came out in the church, and quite frankly, I caved. There's no other way to say it. But that line there is why I gave up the internet, right? This like bits and scraps swarming about in one's brain, trying to hold on to one and rest on it, but not being able to. This is what the internet does to me. And I suspect that it might just do that to you as well. Maybe I'm exceptional. My mum thinks so. But no, maybe, yeah, I am just an addict, and you're not like me, and you can use the internet fine. But I really do suspect that this is true for many of us, because here's what happens, right? We go on the internet, we look at this news site, we read this article about this politician, this religious figure. We watch this YouTube video of this comedian. We go onto Netflix and watch one episode of a series. We have all of this information, and the mind naturally seeks to contain a piece of information, to comprehend it. It's not satisfied to have bits and pieces of things. It wants it all. But when you feed your mind little tidbits of all sorts of information, it seems to me that we very often walk around in this state, just like Raskolnikov, obviously much less intense because he just murdered 2 old women. But this state where there's all of these thoughts buzzing about in our brain, what did that politician do? What did the Pope say? What's that musician's latest album? When's that coming out? When's that comedian coming to town? What happened in that, and we want to rest on them, but we can't find rest. It's almost like we're deliberately fragmenting our interior life so that, I don't know why. I don't know if there's a reason or if it's just because we're irritated, trying to break ourselves up into a million different directions so that we don't have to be with ourselves. I'm not sure. But one of the beautiful things about giving up the internet was that it allowed me to just focus on certain things. So it was the last day of July. I gave my wife my phone. I said, change my password. I gave her my computer. I said, change my password. And that was it. It was this weird feeling. I kept thinking, this is going to sound very dramatic. I kept thinking, it kind of feels like death. Like I'm about to leave this space in which everyone gathers and talks and communicates. I'm about to shut myself off entirely from that. And while most people know that I'm doing that, there's going to be people who don't. And they're going to wonder why I'm not getting back to them. They're going to email me. They're going to think I'm ignoring them. Stuff's going to happen. I'm not going to know about it. I'm not going to know if my podcast went up the way it was supposed to, the way I kind of automated it to, here's what's funny. I thought to myself, this feels like a bit like death. But then I thought, when I'm on my deathbed, I almost certainly won't say, this feels like the time I gave up the internet for 24 days. But you know what I found is there was this sense of anxiety, because again, I just wanted to check stuff. I wanted to tweet stuff. I wanted to see what people were saying, and I couldn't. So I'd wake up, what do I do? What do? You can't check your phone. I guess you have to pray or something, Go and get a coffee, sit down. I remember a priest saying to me, it was in a homily, he was making this analogy to our life, and he said, you think of a jar, and you think of maybe rocks and stones and sand, okay? Have rocks represent very significant moments and important things, okay? You want to fill your life with those things, right? So you want to fill that in the jar. That's what the jar represents your life. And then the pebbles are like the things that bring us joy and are good but aren't the most important things. And then the sand is like the time-wasting things that on your deathbed you won't say, I wish I spent more time doing. He says, but if you fill that jar up with sand, there's no room for the rocks or the stones. But if you put the rocks and the stones in, then you can put the sand in and it'll fill it out, And I think for me, it was like I just fill my life with sand, and I don't have time to do these really important things that I love. Anyway, as I said, I got to read the Brothers Karamazov in like 20 days. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so easy to concentrate on this because I didn't have all of these thoughts buzzing about in my brain. So a little bit about the Brothers Karamazov. So Dostoevsky, obviously a Russian author, an Orthodox Christian. Now, a bit about the brothers. I didn't realize this, but the Brothers Karamazov was Dostoevsky's last book. It was Now, here's what's cool. It was published in serial form in a newspaper called the Russian Herald from January 1879 to November 1880. So almost 2 years. That's pretty crazy, hey? I don't think many of us would have, the interest to follow such a beautiful story today. I guess that was like the Netflix back in the day. But what's great about the Brothers Karamazov, especially if you're thinking to yourself, whoa, that seems way too much. I can't do that. Because it was written in serial form, the chapters are relatively short and they all kind of leave you on a cliffhanger. But not like a cliffhanger that's always, and it just always lets you down. You know how they did that on Lost and 24? It's like, oh my goodness, I gotta watch the next episode! And then you watch the beginning of the next episode, you're like, come on, what was that? It was like that time, do you remember Lost, where, he found that thing in the ground, that metal thing in the ground? What's beneath it? It's a Scottish guy pressing a button, But, so this was actually really fascinating. So it's actually a lot easier to read than you think. So let me just see here, how many chapters? There's a ton of chapters, like 50, maybe 100 chapters, right? And some of them are 10 pages. Again, because this is written on a newspaper. So it's two things. One, you shouldn't be intimidated by it because it was relatively short. And then two, it ends in an exciting way that makes the reader want to keep reading. So those are two reasons you should be interested in the Brothers Karamazov. Okay, let me say one word before we wrap up this episode about the most difficult thing about the Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment or, if you want to read a book by a Russian. The most frustrating thing about it is the names. Russian names are composed of first name, how do I say that? Patronymic, that means from the father's first name, and family name. So if you're addressing somebody formally, you say something else. If you say something in an abusive way, you give them a different name. So, and they're all variations of that same name. So just to give you one example, Dmitri, who's one of the main characters, in this book, he's called Dmitri, Mitya, Mitka, Mitenka, Mitri, Fyodovich. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 5 names, right? And then sometimes the names don't even sound anything alike. So, Alyosha is sometimes called Alexei. So, the problem with that is, if you don't know that, then you're like, who the hell is this character? I don't understand. That's why I wouldn't recommend listening to the audiobook. So one of the ways I got around that is I would just make a decision that whenever I come across Alyosha's name, say, whether they call him Alyoshka, Alyoshenka, Alyosha, Alexia Kick. That's also Alyosha. What? Lyosha? Like Lyosha and Alexia Kick. I can't even say it. It's like, oh, hello. It's like you don't know who they are. So I just made a decision. Whenever I come across his name, however it is said, I'm just going to say Alyosha. So even if it's like Lyosha, I'm going to say Alyosha to kind of get some consistency. And thankfully, in this edition, there's a helpful little guide that shows you all the different ways the names are said. I'd say that's the most difficult thing. Okay, so as I wrap up this episode, maybe some of you are interested in reading The Brothers Karamazov. Maybe you're interested in maybe reading a little bit of Dostoevsky, and you want to know where to start. You know, one thing you could do is read one of his works called Notes from Underground. This is a relatively short book. So for that reason, you might say, okay, well, I'll cut my teeth on that. But otherwise, Crime and Punishment, gosh, it's a fascinating book. And the murder, it's written from the murderer's account, and the murder happens pretty soon into the book, so it's pretty fascinating. However you say cheers in Russian. Thanks for being a patron.